Jeder ist fähig nachzudenken und sich eine Meinung zu bilden. Die BBC hat dann über diesen Einsturz berichtet, aber zu früh. Das heißt, die haben in den 5 Uhr Nachrichten berichtet, aber das Gebäude ist erst um 20 nach 5 eingestürzt und das ist nicht gut. Ja, das ist diese Sache. Ja. Die Historiker sind zwar langsam, ja, ist jetzt schon 17 Jahre her, aber wir sind dafür genau. Und als ich herausgefunden habe, dass die zu früh berichten, habe ich mir gesagt, das geht ja gar nicht.
Und da ist Ihnen klar geworden, wie wichtig Sie als Historiker sind, weil Sie schreiben in die Bücher das rein, was später die Wahrheit sein wird.
Genau. Es liegt jetzt, die Leute verstehen das gar nicht. Sie denken, ja, die Historiker, das ist auch noch so eine abgestaubte Truppe, die interessiert, ist nicht interessant. Aber man muss schon verstehen, zuerst kommen die Politiker, erzählen ihr Ding. Dann kommen die Journalisten, schreiben ihr Ding. Am Schluss schreiben die Historiker die Geschichtsbücher.
Also ich weiß schon, dass wenn ich etwas sage, dass andere das sehen. Ja? Und darum vielleicht nochmal, um das zu erklären, ich werde diffamiert, ich diffamiere nicht zurück. Also das ist schon, dass ich mich an den Werten orientieren, die mir selber am Herzen liegen: Mut, Liebe und Wahrheit.
Wenn wir die Wahrheit verlieren, dann verlieren wir jegliche Orientierung. Schauen wir uns das kurz an. Das ist Jane Stanley. Sie steht vor WTC 7. Das WTC 7 ist rechts hinter ihr zu sehen. WTC 7 wäre das höchste Gebäude in der Schweiz. Und in New York fällt es natürlich nicht auf, weil das sind so viele hohe Gebäude. Und sie sagt, das 47-Story Salomon Brothers Building, also das ist ein anderer Name für WTC 7, weil Salomon Brothers einer der Mieter war, sei auch eingestürzt.
For me, really, the smoking gun is World Trade Center 7.
Trotzdem ist es meiner Meinung nach wichtig, dass ein Forscher vor allem der Wahrheit verpflichtet ist.
Wenn ihr das wirklich nötig habt, mich zu diffamieren, ich diffamiere euch nicht.
Das ist der Bericht. 5 Uhr Nachrichten. Jane Stanley, die Journalistin, berichtet über den Einsturz von WTC 7, aber es steht noch hinten dran. Das ist Fake News. Es ist um 20 nach 5. Ja, es ist wirklich... Jane Stanley hat das dann eingeräumt 2008. Das war ein Fehler. Ja, es war ein Fehler.
Eine alte Metapher, die der Sohn von Pfarrer Ganser gewiss kennt.
Problem ist aber, sie ist selber nicht schuld, weil man hat ihr das zugespielt und die Journalisten lesen das von einem Teleprompter ab. Ja? Sie als Fernsehzuschauerin merken das nicht. Sie denken, ja, die weiß das einfach. Nein, die liest etwas ab. Auch Trump liest alles ab. Ja, der weiß wenig von dem, was er sagt. Man hat mir keine Frage, sondern eine Aussage über eine Tatsache hingeworfen. Ich weiß nicht, woher diese Aussage kam.
Noch eine Metapher, die der Herr Pfarrerssohn sicherlich kennt.
Ich kann mir nicht vorstellen, warum man über den Einsturz von WTC 7 berichtet, wenn es noch steht.
Hallo, schön, dass Sie da sind. Bitte kein Missverständnis. Die BBC hat den Einsturz von Gebäude 7 zu früh gemeldet. Der Fehler ist passiert, das ist eine Tatsache. In diesem Video geht es nicht um das Ob, sondern um das Wie und das Warum. Und es geht um unsere Menschlichkeit. Wir alle machen Fehler. Der Mensch irrt sich. Ich auch. Und Sie? Ich möchte nicht in einer Welt leben, wo Menschen keine Fehler machen dürfen, wo uns kleine Irrtümer ein Leben lang vorgehalten werden. Eine grausame, unmenschliche Welt wäre das.
20 Jahre sind vergangen seit den Terroranschlägen vom 11. September. Die Frage, die für mich im Raum steht, ist, wurden wir ehrlich und sachlich informiert über diesen Terroranschlag? Die BBC-Journalistin Jane Stanley, ich habe mich dann gefragt, ja, also bitte, aber haben denn die Fernsehnachrichten darüber berichtet? Und dann habe ich gesucht und viele Fernsehsender haben nicht darüber berichtet. Da war ich traurig. Und dann habe ich mich gefreut, BBC hat darüber berichtet, Jane Stanley. Und da habe ich mich gefreut, da habe ich gedacht, okay, immerhin in den Medien wurde darüber berichtet, aber dann habe ich herausgefunden, sie hat zu früh berichtet. Ja. Sie hat berichtet in den 5 Uhr Nachrichten, aber das Gebäude fiel um 20 nach 5 und das ist jetzt eben auch kein Qualitätsjournalismus. Hier steht's, die Journalistin berichtet zu früh.
là, quelqu'un m'a dit, mais BBC a fait un rapport, j'ai regardé les archives, parce que quand même, il y a les archives, on peut regarder la télévision de ce jour-là, et j'ai trouvé que BBC a fait un rapport sur le 3e tour, et j'étais tout content. Je dis, ah, très bien. Après, j'étais pas tellement content, parce que j'ai vu, ils ont fait un rapport à 5 heures, mais le bâtiment, World Trade Center 7, s'est écrasé à 5h20. Et là, c'est Jane Stanley qui fait le rapport.
Und da habe ich noch gesehen, dass die Medien nicht darüber berichtet haben, habe ich die Medien durchgeschaut, es kam nicht am Fernsehen und plötzlich habe ich einen Fernsehsender gefunden, der darüber berichtet hat, über WTC 7, habe ich mich sehr gefreut, BBC, Jane Stanley hat darüber berichtet und dann habe ich herausgefunden, die hat zu früh berichtet.
So this is Jane Stanley at the 5 o'clock news on BBC telling that the Solomon Brothers building, which is the World Trade Center 7, collapsed. But the building is standing behind her.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. But New York, very much a city still in chaos. The phones are not working.
That's fake news. It's fake news.
Aber insgesamt ein riesengroßes Gebäude. Okay, das möchte ich Ihnen eigentlich erklären. Nur in New York fällt das nicht auf. Das ist analytisch die Hauptschwierigkeit. Die meisten Menschen nehmen WTC 7 nicht wahr, weil es wie ein Baum im Wald steht.
Und das ist auch nicht gut, weil wir Historiker sind sehr konservativ. Wir haben eine Regel, die heißt, zuerst das Ereignis, dann der Bericht. Ja. Wenn das vertauscht wird, dann werden wir misstrauisch. Und es ist genau dieser Zustand, in dem wir uns jetzt befinden. Es ist ein Zustand des Misstrauens. Und Jane Stanley kann sicher nichts dafür. Sie war einfach die Journalistin vor Ort. Sie hat von einem Teleprompter abgelesen und sie sagt, it was a mistake. I was thrown, not a question, but a statement of fact. I don't know where it came from. Das heißt, sie hat es einfach vorgelesen. Sie wurde dann von der 9/11-Truth-Bewegung angegriffen. Sie und Janie hätten sozusagen die Terroranschläge inszeniert, was natürlich so auch nicht stimmt. Und sie hatte dann ein Burnout und hat ein Jahr Timeout genommen.
Also was ich Ihnen somit sagen möchte ist, wir leben in einem Zeitalter von Fake News und völliger Verwirrung. Völliger Verwirrung. Jane Stanley was the journalist. She was standing in front and she said at the 5 o'clock news, she said the 47-story Salomon Brothers building close to the World Trade Center has also collapsed. The Salomon Brothers building is World Trade Center 7. But at that time, the building is standing behind her. So that's fake news. It doesn't say that on TV, right? That I put that in. Fake news. And in 2008, she had to take a stand. Okay? And she said it was a mistake. She said, I was thrown, not a question, but a statement of fact. I don't know where that came from. So really what she does is she's reading out from a teleprompter. Okay, so I know how journalists work. She didn't do the research, she was just there doing live reporting, meaning reading out of a prompter.
Sie wissen also, wie Journalisten arbeiten. Wirklich, Herr Ganser?
Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers
Es gibt
building?
nur einen Vortrag in 10 Jahren, in dem das Publikum eine kurze Filmsequenz zu sehen bekommt. Und das war hier.
Phones are not working.
That's fake news.
Dies ist, was das normale Publikum zu sehen bekommt. Der Rest ist Trust Me.
Und ich habe mich dann entschieden, die Fakten nochmal zu prüfen.
Und das wird durch einen Meinungsführer in der Tagesschau gebracht. Das heißt, wenn Sie in der Tagesschau einen sehen mit Brille, kann auch ohne Brille sein, und der spricht so im Sinne von, ich habe die Sache untersucht, trust me, dann nehmen Sie sich einen Schritt zurück.
Genau. Also wollen wir uns anschauen, was Jane Stanley wirklich gesagt und getan hat. Ein paar kritische Fragen. Hat sie den Einsturz dieses Gebäudes berichtet? Hat sie gesagt, das Gebäude sei eingestürzt? Hat sie abgelesen oder frei gesprochen? Hat sie von einem Teleprompter abgelesen? Sehen Sie den Buchstaben D wie Delta in Ihrem Namen?
Nein. Hat das einen Einfluss? Ja.
Wir alle machen Fehler. Wir alle schreiben mal einen Namen falsch. Wenn wir den gleichen Fehler aber 10 Jahre lang wiederholen und niemals korrigieren, also dann schauen wir mal.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. But this isn't the first building that has suffered as a result. We know that part of the Marriott Hotel next to the World Trade Center also collapsed as a result of this huge amount of falling debris from 110 floors of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity of this city, but completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to them today.
Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off and evacuated, apart from the emergency workers. That was done by the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, much earlier today, because of, course, the dreadful collapse of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. But New York, very much a city still in chaos. The phones are not working properly, the subway lines are not working properly. And we know that down there near the World Trade Center there are 3 schools that are being turned into triage centers for emergency treatment. And I know that over in New York Harbor, where the famous Statue of Liberty is, there's a field hospital where 1,500 people are being treated. And we have heard, though it's unconfirmed as yet, that 100 New York City police officers have been taken there as well for treatment. But we do need to confirm those figures for the officers.
It's now, what, some 8 hours since the attacks. Is there any estimate yet available of the number of casualties in the World Trade Center?
I think we can only go at this point with the words expressed by the mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, that it's too frightening to think how many there could be. We know that it's about almost 300 people on the airliners that were used in these attacks. But you've got to remember, this was 9 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday morning. It's busy in downtown Manhattan, in the financial district then. The World Trade Center itself has 50,000 workers. There are tens of thousands of tourists who go up there every day. The figures are almost too frightening to contemplate. You can understand why nobody yet wants to put a figure on them.
Listening to the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, a bit earlier, one of his messages was, business as usual. We won't let this get us down. But presumably, a lot of Manhattan people must have fled the city to Long Island to get away from possible further attacks.
Well, a lot of people were certainly trying to, but you remember that very early on, all the bridges and tunnels to the city, as well as the airports, were closed. New York was sealed, essentially. Now, we do know that the Long Island Railroad has begun running again to get people out of the city if they can, and people who can't manage to get out and perhaps lived in that area, they're being offered accommodation in empty school buildings. But certainly I saw earlier on today huge crowds of people desperately trying to walk up upper Manhattan to get as far away as possible. I think nobody really knows how to go or where to go, and you have to remember even now, I don't think people can sink in to people what's happened.
We haven't for the past hour or so heard much from the people of Manhattan. You're with them there. I mean, what are they saying tonight after this catastrophic attack?
As I said, many just cannot believe this has happened, and I've seen, big burly men and women with tears in their eyes today, shaking their heads, wondering what on earth is going on. There was a sense of panic. Our reports from the scene were of people just absolutely horrified, and I've already seen some photographs of that a man took down in the downtown area, and it looks like the aftermath of a huge atom bomb or something, just full of debris and of like a white carpeting of snow from all the dust and rubbish that had fallen. I don't think people can comprehend. They certainly have lost any feeling of safety. There's still a great pride in the city. People are determined to fight back, but a great sense of shock and loss. People keep looking at the sky, for example, where you can see the plume of smoke, and say, when that's gone, it won't be there anymore. Our Twin Towers won't be there. Such a symbol of New York.
Are they talking yet about revenge and what the government should do to counter this threat, or are they numbed still?
I think people are still numb, and I don't think people are talking about revenge in that way at all yet. I think people are still too traumatized. We don't know how many people have been killed. We can't even put a figure. I think when you talk to people on they daren't even say how many people might have been killed and injured, and I think that feeling, until idea of the devastation, people don't really know what to say or what to think. I think they feel the bubble of their security as being in America has definitely been popped. This city and this country will not be the same, but they don't really know where to turn. That's the very sad thing. I think there's going to be a lot of very, very traumatized people that has hit them very, very hard.
Jane, I think many of us, when we heard the news, perhaps on the radio earlier today, were completely flabbergasted by it and just couldn't comprehend it. I mean, it almost sounded too far-fetched. I was wondering what it's felt like for you being in Manhattan. Well, unfortunately, I think we've lost the line with Jane Stanley in Manhattan. Perhaps we can rejoin her and follow that up later.
Dann dieses Buch aus 2020. Jane Stanley, ohne die Delta, habe berichtet. Doppelt hält besser. Das Gebäude war zu sehen.
Die meisten Menschen nehmen WTC 7 nicht wahr, weil es wie ein Baum im Wald steht.
Die Reporterin war erst seit wenigen Tagen in New York, nach 7 Jahren als Afrika-Korrespondentin in Nairobi und Johannesburg. Aber welche Verwirrung! In England. BBC World ist das Auslandsprogramm. Nur sehr wenige Zuschauer in Deutschland sehen auch die Nachrichten der Deutschen Welle. Schauen wir also zunächst, wie die Zuschauer in England informiert wurden.
Well, now you're watching BBC News 24. It's our business coverage, of course, and we have some remarkable pictures coming in from New York, which we can go to now, and they show us that one of the world's tallest buildings, right in the heart of the business district of Manhattan, the World Trade Center, appears to be on fire. As you can see, something has clearly happened towards the top of the building, and these are very dramatic live pictures coming into the BBC right now.
David Lown for the moment. Thank you. John.
OK, Valerie, we can cross over now to our correspondent Stephen Evans in New York. Stephen Evans, our economic correspondent there. Steve, I understand that you were in the World Trade Center when it was struck.
I was on the ground floor of the building, sitting in a chair, waiting for somebody to turn up, as you do. There was a huge bang. It felt to me like somebody dropped a skip full of rubbish, a great container full of rubbish from a very great height, in the yard which separates the two huge towers which are the World Trade Center. The building physically shook, but it's one of those things where you think, well, something's happened on a building site, that's the way it is. But seconds later, there were 2 or 3 similar huge explosions, and the building literally shook. You literally shook at the base of this building, at which point people came, I nearly said screaming. They weren't screaming. It was a mild panic, if you like. People simply saying, get out of here, get out of here. People streaming to the other side of the building, at which point smoke appeared everywhere, as though a mist had suddenly settled on the building. We all streamed out, some people running, some people crying, nobody really screaming, across the road, and you look up and you could see the top of one of the towers, smoke billowing out from it, the odd flame coming out from the top of these towers, pretty well the highest buildings in the world. Everybody then got calm and simply looked up, and as the authorities moved them further and further away, I would guess, time is very difficult to judge in these circumstances, but I would guess about 5 minutes later, there was another explosion halfway down the second tower, and that then looked rent, almost as though a child had knocked into a toy, something like that. And again, smoke started billowing out of that second building. I don't know what the cause was. Everybody, I think, initially assumed it was a bomb, but then people kept coming past me saying, no, it was a jet, it was a jet. Whether it was 1 or 2, I simply don't know. I'm now in a hotel about 100 yards from the building. Buildings in the area are being evacuated. People are streaming away. Nobody's saying very much, actually, because they are shocked, as you'd expect them to be. People simply don't quite comprehend what's happening. You can hear the shaking in people's voices as they say, what's going on? What's going on? I don't know. And people are nodding at me now as I say that. The cause, I can't illuminate. All I can tell you, it was a very frightening experience, but people by and large reacted very well to it.
Well, Stephen, let me explain to viewers on BBC One and News 24 the pictures that we're currently seeing for those who've just joined us. We're watching both towers of the World Trade Center. Both towers of the World Trade Center on fire. Early reports suggest that 6 people have been killed, more than 1,000 injured, but of course, as anybody can tell, just simply looking at those pictures, the total number of fatalities seem likely to rise significantly beyond that. Shortly before 2 o'clock United Kingdom time, which is 9 a.m. in the United States, a twin-engine passenger plane crashed into the North Tower of the 110-story World Trade Center. A few minutes later, a small passenger plane crashed into the second tower, the South Tower. Early reports from the FBI suggest that at least one of these planes may have been hijacked before crashing into the towers. As I say, 6 people killed at the moment. That's the earliest estimate that we have.
Well,
Valerie.
let's go back to Steve Evans, our correspondent, who was actually in the World Trade Center building. There we have the pictures back. What's happening there now, Steve?
People are simply milling around. Some people are clearly just getting out of the area. Other people are milling around. Not all the buildings have been evacuated. You talked, or your colleague talked earlier about the timing of this. It would have been about 9 o'clock in the morning here, the start of the working day in perhaps the busiest complex of buildings, who knows, in the world. These 2 towers, they are the World Trade Center. They employ 50,000 people. And at 9 o'clock in the morning, the Underground Railway is spewing out people as they make their way into these 2 huge towers for a day's work. So, I don't know. We are speculating, but it clearly was a very, very busy time of the day.
We're getting reports, Steve, that at least 6 people have been killed and 1,000 injured. But obviously, looking at this incredible devastation, those numbers inevitably are going to rise, we would think.
It's always very hard to speculate about numbers, but I mean, it's hard to imagine looking at this thing. You've got one of the world's biggest office complexes in the world. there has clearly been a very big explosion in one tower and perhaps an even bigger explosion in the other tower at the very top. I find it inconceivable that numbers of people haven't been killed or seriously injured. I don't know what the numbers are. The area at the base of the tower has now been evacuated as the emergency services go in. I would imagine that the rescue operation has got to be very, very difficult and very, very tentatively done. These buildings are way beyond ladders. I mean, where these explosions occurred are way, way beyond ladders. How the emergency services get up there, and furthermore ascertain that more explosions won't happen, because as I say, these explosions were quite spaced apart. Now, if there are two aircraft involved, that may explain that, but the explosions were spaced apart. I presume that the assumption of the emergency services will be, who knows what may now happen. The engineering involved in working out what a plane crashing into a tower that high is incomprehensible. I don't imagine much work has been done on it. As I say, the explosion was so huge, so tremulous, that it shook the very base, literally the very base of the building.
And Steve, looking at the towers now and how damaged there are, there must be a very real risk that they'll fall and onto buildings surrounding. I mean, not only must there be a huge rescue operation on now, they must want to evacuate the area too.
Well, they've evacuated to within, I would have thought, 200 meters of the towers. I presume some kind of assessment of the risk of those buildings falling down has been done. But having said all that, all the engineering work was done when they were built for all kinds of eventualities. These explosions gave those buildings, or the building I was in, one almighty thwack. And it did move, but it didn't feel like it was going to fall down. As I said, initially, I simply thought there'd been a bit of an accident on a construction site very, very near. I can't tell you what the risks are. I can tell you that the area immediately around the buildings has been evacuated, but not the area beyond about half a mile, which is where I'm standing.
Steve Evans, for the moment, thanks very much indeed. Let me bring in our diplomatic editor now. No, let's go over to hear what the President, George Bush, is saying.
I unfortunately will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary of Rod Page and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today we've had a national tragedy.
Rob, for now, thank you very much indeed. Let's cross to Jane Stanley, who's in New York. Jane, when one sees the towers collapsing, as we have done several times by now, the World Trade Center, it's difficult to imagine the scale of that devastation. What can you tell us so far about the efforts that the emergency services are putting in? Because understandably, they'll be overwhelmed.
They are totally overwhelmed. As you can see behind me, this whole area of downtown Manhattan, where the twin towers of the World Trade Center were, is now a plume of smoke. It's sealed off. The emergency services, we know, are working hard. I don't know if you can hear yet another emergency vehicle. Most of them have very sadly been ambulances coming up the street further into Manhattan, almost like a feeling that the further you get away from it, the safer you are. And I saw crowds of people just traveling as fast as they could on foot, the subways closed, just trying to get away from this part of Manhattan. But the emergency services, in terms of hospitals, they're dealing with people with dreadful burns, they've said, and they're also appealing for emergency blood donors. And we've seen lines of people queuing up to donate blood and outside some of the hospitals.
One of the most disturbing elements, of course, still this evening, Jane, is the fact that some of the airline companies are saying they still have passenger planes unaccounted for. Now, I know that information is pretty scarce, but is there any latest word on that?
Not that I'm aware of. Information is the scarcest thing here. It's almost as if America's kind of withdraw, certainly the arms of government and the emergency and security services have withdrawn into themselves just to try and get a grip on what's going on here and to try, obviously, to find out what went wrong, how this happened, and perhaps to catch those who might have been responsible in a wider group. But that whole area behind me, that's the heart of the world's financial district. It's the heart of New York. There's subway lines there that all go in. There's huge office buildings around there. People had to be moved from that area. There's going to be such incredible damage. But I think our first thoughts must go to however many hundreds, we don't know, even thousands of people could be still within the rubble there. The building, as Rob Watson said, the World Trade Center, had 50,000 people working in it. We don't know how many were in there at the time, but people do go to work early. And we just can't even think of what is going on down there.
Jane, the tragedy unfolding, as you so rightly say. Thank you very much indeed for that. And over in Washington, Rob, thank you very much too.
Thanks very much. Let's join Jane Stanley now, who's in New York this afternoon. Jane, good afternoon. We can see the smoke still billowing out behind you. Has the mood changed in New York in these 7 hours?
I don't think it has really. It went from a very early disbelief as these events unfolded live on American television screens. People saying, oh, this is like a movie. I couldn't believe that this would happen. And I think then to utter horror as the Twin Towers collapsed. And the only change really, I think, has been a deepening of the sickness that people feel here, a deepening of the fear, because as we can see with the smoke still billowing out of the World Trade Center and the horror that lies underneath that rubble, people are very frightened about what is going to be found there, because we still have no idea of fatalities. On casualties, we know 600 people are in the city's hospitals and 1,500 more are being treated at a tent hospital set up in Liberty Island Park out in the Bay of New York. But still, no way of coming to terms with something like this.
Are the rescue services at work on the site, on the rubble of those two huge buildings, or is it a place it's impossible to conceive anybody could remain alive underneath?
It's hard to know because behind me, where the Twin Towers are, just beyond that, the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, has actually closed down the majority of the city. He's just forced a line and everyone else has been evacuated out. We see behind us regularly coming ambulances, sirens wailing of people. We really have no idea who's being taken from the scene. But of course, rescue efforts are still going on. But when you think of 110 stories, 2 towers falling down, it's a huge area that will have been devastated, very hard to get at. And of course the city, the Red Cross here, appealing for blood donors, people being treated for burns, but kind of as the downtown area, the financial area of Manhattan behind me has been closed down, in many ways so has the information network. For example, we're hearing nothing at all on fatalities. Perhaps it's too horrible for the authorities here to even contemplate yet.
Jane, thank you very much. We know perhaps slightly less about what happened in Washington at the Pentagon building. And now we join Paddy O'Connell again in New York with the latest news of what's happening there. Paddy.
I think, David, what's becoming clear is that this is not over. That is to say, if you look at the pictures of Manhattan, downtown where it happened, the mayor has evacuated part of Lower Manhattan. That will be no surprise. But if you think back a step as to why, it's because buildings remain unstable. This is the scene around the building that collapsed, but the question being asked is, what about the buildings that were standing immediately after it? Now, I don't, where I'm sitting in Midtown Manhattan, have an answer to that question, but I'm afraid this question is the one that's preoccupying us, because underneath the rubble is the answer to the question, how many people have lost their lives? We know there are displaced people. We know there are disgusted people all across this country. And here there are people trying to get home. But as I speak to you, David, we don't know the answer to the question of the scale of the human tragedy. The analysis, important as it is, will be had. But the figures on people, we just don't know.
What sort of flow of information is there? You say nothing is really known, but is everybody, is information still coming out from the World Trade Center down there?
We have an unconfirmed report of a building collapse. At times like this, you want to hear directly from the city authorities. I passed one of the major hospitals 4 hours ago. They were shouting for blood donations in the street. And about half an hour later, many of us were reporting that they were looking for blood across the city. So it's a very much of an immediate return to the most basic way of communicating in a city of this scale. People are confused as much as they are disgusted. People are dead and people don't know about it. So there is a stoicism here. I would say we would be clinging to the word panic and forgetting that people are getting on with it, clearing it up, and angry. But equally, we are focusing in the attention now on what's under that rubble. And here, the situation on Times Square, I don't know if we can bring you, David, the picture behind me. This was full earlier of people. It's now deserted. This makes me think people are heading home. I'm concluding this because one avenue is shut behind me, 7th Avenue, but this was full of around 500 people 3 hours ago. Where have they gone? We think they've gone home, and we don't know the answer to that either.
And is there a feeling that America will be able to revenge this in some way, or indeed prevent its happening, anything like it happening again? Or are people fatalistic about it?
I think a shock has turned to anger already. I heard the first mention of Pearl Harbor was from a man on the street down here. Then we spoke to a foreign policy expert, and you've surrounded by many names that will be familiar around the world, of course, but the person that we were speaking to saying, America will respond to a moment in time. This is a moment in time. It'll be hard for the president to resist some kind of call for action from the world's richest democracy. The question is, of course, and it's not for me to answer what action that will be, but yes, the word on the street from people I've spoken to is they do want action.
Paddy O'Connor, thank you very much indeed for that report. Well, there have been comparisons between today's events and the impact on the United States of Japan's surprise attack at Pearl Harbor in World War II. We've heard that said several times during this program. The difference is that then there was an enemy. To suffer the shock without knowing who's responsible or how to retaliate creates confusion and panic, which is exactly what the perpetrators of this atrocity intended. September the 11th, 2001, will be remembered as an attack not just on the United States, but on the very concept of a secure and orderly world, an attack on all of us. Coverage continues now on BBC News 24 with my colleagues Carrie Gracie and Gavin Esler.
You're watching a BBC News 24 special report, continuing our coverage also on BBC One.
Good evening. There can be few people now who know nothing of the extraordinary and horrifying events of this afternoon in the United States. Well, for the next half hour, we're going to focus on how Americans first learned of the terrorist attacks, how they were kept informed of the latest appalling details, and how Americans have been reacting.
What to do?
Now, we're hearing reports that there may be another building in New York which may be about to collapse, which explains some of the terrible difficulties the emergency services are having there right on the southern tip of Manhattan, right beside the World Trade Center. Tom, the World Trade Center is one of the obvious symbols, not just of America, but of world capitalism, or how the markets work in this country. The Pentagon is the clearest symbol of American power.
Yeah.
It's fairly obvious whoever did this was deliberately trying to humiliate as best they could the United States.
Well, absolutely. And also the World Trade Center, if you happen to have an airplane, is probably relatively easy to hit. But it is reminiscent of that awful day in '98 when 2 of our embassies were hit within 2 minutes. Clearly a coordinated attack, and it takes... This requires a lot more coordination, I would say. So it's really horrendous. Now, the other building in Lower Manhattan, I think the World Trade Center, we know the 2 towers, but there are about 6 buildings that are all part of the World Trade Center. They're all pretty close or even connected. So I wouldn't be surprised if fire had spread from one to the other, and those are now going.
When we talk about the way in which Americans must be viewing these pictures tonight, how do you think they'll be feeling? I mean, have you been in contact with friends and relatives in the United States?
Well, yeah, I have 2 kids in America, and my wife and I had a pretty frantic time finding them and making sure they were okay, which they were, thank God. I've had people pouring into my office here in London all day, Americans saying, just get me in touch, just let me get home to my family. I can't get in touch with America either, you know, but that's what they want.
John, there we must leave it. Thank you.
Now we're going to go straight over to New York, to Manhattan, to talk to John Berman, a reporter for ABC. John, what can you tell us about these reports that there are dangers of another building collapsing?
There are dangers of another building collapsing right there on the street near where the Twin Towers have already collapsed. Those people who have been down there say the smoke is still piling into the sky. There's about a foot of debris on the ground. The situation is still very tenuous. We're told that officials have been told to back off from the area completely because they are very worried that another building is very close to coming down.
So what can they do in terms of the emergency operation for the World Trade Center Twin Towers?
Well, unfortunately, they can't do much right now. They're very concerned about the remaining structure in those 2 buildings, if they are safe. They're concerned about the buildings nearby, and they're concerned about the air. It's not just smoke that's in the air right now. It's floating debris. It's particles. The cars and ambulances that are racing from there are covered in soot. The people who come out of there, the firemen, are covered in soot. I've seen them head into showers, into makeshift showers with fire hoses to clean off. It is a bad scene down there right now, and it might be some time before any real search and rescue operation does begin.
Tell us just how it's been for you and your team actually trying to report this in Manhattan.
It's been a crazy day. What happened was we get to work just as the first plane ran into one of the Twin Towers, and a lot of people from ABC and other news organizations raced downtown immediately. By the time they got here, the second building had already been hit, and that's when the buildings fell down. It was a staggering sight. It was as if the whole lower part of the city let go with a collective scream, and there was a rumble that you could feel not just in your ears but in your entire body. It was really stunning. And since the buildings went down, it's just been amazing to see how many officials, firefighters are trying to help out, trying to get as close as they can. There have been people evacuated from the scene. People who are as high up as 88 stories in the building were evacuated and have survived. So there are some good stories, but there's a fear of many people being killed.
Because of course these buildings were never designed to be evacuated at high speed. What can be done now for the people who are believed still to be inside there?
Well, unfortunately, Americans have had some experience with evacuating or trying to get people out of buildings that have been demolished. Oklahoma City, of course, the federal building there was exploded, and people were pulled out of that for hours and hours, and in some cases days afterwards alive. These buildings behind me have just been demolished. It is unclear how many people may still be buried in there, how many people may be alive, how many people dead. I did talk to one firefighter who was down there when one of the buildings collapsed, and he was temporarily covered in soot and ashes and debris, and he actually had to dig himself out. And then he raced back to a command center and showered off, and he could be right back in there now trying to help other people.
John, we know that more than 100 hospitals are involved in trying to help the casualties. What reports have you managed to gather from the hospitals about the kinds of injuries and about just the state of the casualties?
Everything you can imagine. All the hospitals around here are filled with people now. We hear some hospitals have 100, some 200, some people have 4 people who have come in and died. It's so big right now, it's hard to get your arms around exactly what's happening, how many people have been killed or wounded. There are no reliable numbers yet. We have spoken to a few hospitals who are trying to help as many wounded as possible. And there are calls out right now for blood donors. And of course, the most rare types of blood available, they want as much of that as they can get. O negative, they're calling out anyone who may be able to donate that type of blood. Please go to a donor center right now.
John, we'll leave it there, but many thanks.
Well, it's just been confirmed that President George Bush is now on his way back to the White House.
When they do, I don't think you're going to find something like an antiseptic strike with Tomahawk missiles, but something much more sustained, intense, and long-term.
Mr. Lieber, again, as you're talking, news is continuing to come in, as you can imagine. We're now being told that yet another enormous building in New York has collapsed. It is the 47-story Salomon Brothers building, which was situated very close to the World Trade Center right there in this financial capital. Professor Lieber, the implications of what you are saying is that this will absolutely be seen as an act of war by the ordinary people of the United States. Never mind the fact the military is on alert, ordinary folk will feel this is an act of war.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of coherent policy, during the last decade, the United States has not had any kind of overarching sense of threat of the sort that it had during World War II or the Cold War. That's changed. When at the level of the man on the street or the woman on the street, they sense something with a very real, immediate, and durable impact, then you've got an entirely different situation. This reverberates around the country, not just in New York or Washington. There are hundreds of people who will have lost friends and relatives in California. Those planes were destined for San Francisco and Los Angeles. There are people across the country who will be immediately affected, and the symbolism of this is extraordinary. So I think the long-term impacts on policy are very great, and we will have crossed a watershed with these terrible assaults of this morning.
Professor Lieber, thank you very much for joining us from Washington.
Thank you.
And people are still being rescued from ruined buildings in New York. Here's the experience of some of the people caught up in the attacks.
The plaza we were on. It was complete dark. There is no light. So thank God somebody with little light came up because we couldn't even see what's happening. We all, with dust and debris and. How'd you get out? Well, the firefighter, somebody with little light came eventually, and we were following him.
And go to.
What did you do?
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed the light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
Okay, we were standing in front of the Soho Grand Hotel. And the doorman, I'm with the fire alarm company, the doorman goes to me, wow, I've never seen a plane flying so low. And we looked out at it, all of a sudden, boom, it seemed like it wasn't even real. And we came running over here closer to the place, and all of a sudden we saw the other explosion. I don't know. That's all I saw. I saw a couple of people jumping out of the other building. I've seen 2 or 3 people jump out of the building.
Let's just briefly bring you up to date and see if we can run some of those latest pictures which are coming in from New York. We're told that yet another building has now collapsed at the south end of Manhattan near the World Trade Center. It was the 47-story Salomon Brothers building next to the World Trade Center. There are still fears that even more buildings could actually collapse. The White House is saying now that President Bush will address the nation tonight. No time has been given, but we understand the president is on his way back to the White House after having gone to Nebraska to Strategic Air Command, which was the command center where, in the event of war, it would be expected that the war would have been run by the president and his staff. And of course, many Americans are indeed comparing today's events to the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor 60 years ago. At that time, in 1941, President Roosevelt said it was a day which would live in infamy. For most Americans, today is not so different. From this BBC News 24 special programme, goodbye.
Did you know how easy it is to watch almost all your favourite BBC programmes with subtitles? From award-winning drama and comedy to films, sports coverage and the local and national news. You can find subtitles for all sorts of programmes on CFAX page 888. Or if you're a digital viewer, simply select subtitles from the menu. Log on to bbc.co.uk/info for more details.
Due to tonight's schedule changes, we were unable to bring you Murder Rooms. It will return to BBC One next Tuesday at 8:30.
70% of our planet is covered by water, yet we know little about the seas around us. Now a new series takes you further out and deeper down to show you things that have never been seen before. The Blue Planet starts tomorrow at 9 on BBC One. Until now, we've only touched the surface.
This is BBC One. Now the BBC News with Peter Sissons. It's 10 o'clock.
Terrorists attack the heart of America with catastrophic loss of life. Hijacked planes smash into and destroy New York's tallest buildings. Both towers of the World Trade Center collapse with thousands trapped. Another plane explodes on the Pentagon, mocking America's defensive might. In the streets, panic and the certainty that casualties are horrendous. Tonight, Britain imposes drastic security measures as Blair condemns the terrorist barbarism. Good evening. America came under attack today from international terrorists on a scale that made it more an act of war. The centre of New York is still smouldering, with America's two tallest buildings in ruins. Terrorists also struck with remarkable ease at the heart of America's defence, the Pentagon. Also in Washington, other government buildings, symbols of American power, were emptied as the terror spread. Air traffic is paralysed. Coast to coast, all key installations are on high alert. And amid the nightmare, the only estimate of fatalities is that they could run into many thousands. Out of the blue, at 9:15 this morning, New York time, a hijacked airliner carrying dozens of passengers flew straight into the World Trade Center's North Tower with devastating effect. 18 minutes later, a second attack. Another hijacked jet struck the Trade Center's twin South Tower, exploding in a huge fireball. Next, it was the turn of Washington and the Pentagon, the nerve center of America's military. A third hijacked American airliner, again with dozens of passengers on board, deliberately flown into the side of the building. As panic spread on the streets, all civilian flights were grounded. New York Stock Exchange was suspended, and the White House was evacuated, along with thousands of personnel in other government buildings. Then, the unthinkable. The South Tower of the World Trade Center, the world's fourth tallest building, collapsed, followed minutes later by the center's second tower. The building, symbol of global trade and workplace for 50,000 people, reduced to rubble. No one knows how many have died. A fourth hijacked plane crashed later in Pennsylvania. 45 people were on board. There were no survivors. There's been a stunned reaction across America and around the world. Here, Tony Blair has called an emergency cabinet committee meeting and put Britain on a high state of alert. Our first report on the day that terrorism struck at the heart of the world's most powerful nation is from James Robbins.
It should have been a perfect day. But just before 9 o'clock, the pure blue sky over Manhattan was filling with smoke. A hijacked American airliner had just smashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. No one quite knew what had happened. Surely this must have been a terrible accident. But what happened next showed these were no accidents. A second hijacked airliner, a Boeing 767 with 92 people on board, is flying straight for the other tower. By now, many hundreds of people must already have been dead, and the unfolding disaster could be seen all around New York.
There's another one. I'm taking a look. Oh my God! Oh, Jesus! Oh my God! My own eye. Just went in. Must be a car or something. Oh my God! Another plane just went in.
At that time, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center, many thousands more in the Wall Street financial district all around. Those who could were running for their lives.
Let's just... I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the South Tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
But it wasn't only New York and America's financial heart which was under attack. Now it was the nation's capital too. In Washington, the Pentagon was hit, headquarters for the armed forces of the world's superpower. A third hijacked airliner, again with dozens on board, had been crashed with devastating results. By now, smoke was billowing around Capitol Hill, and the White House was being evacuated. People were talking of a new Pearl Harbor, someone declaring war on the United States. And back in New York, the nightmare was still far from over. Firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above was safe. The unthinkable was about to happen. The South Tower, all 110 stories, collapsed, and it was all live on American television.
Thanks very much.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
On the ground, emergency services hardly knew which way to turn. People still trapped in the second tower had seen it all and could only wave in desperation. But it was already too late for rescue. The second tower, representing America's trade and wealth, was about to go. The Twin Towers, which took 7 years to build, had been utterly destroyed in a single morning. The Manhattan skyline and countless lives devastated.
Do not go down the ground. You will get trapped. You will get trapped. Don't go.
Big boom. Come down the steps. Everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped in there with another guy. Crawled out. Kept getting hit in the head. Had bags rolled around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down.
You did all right. All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
Even the bloodied felt incredibly lucky on this terrible day. And firefighters could embrace each other for a few moments before facing many more hours of trauma. As New York struggled to cope, to adapt to the clogging dust, the fallout of so much tragedy, more news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this. The centers of that power had been evacuated, key congressional leaders taken to secret locations. The president himself whisked to a nuclear bunker in Nebraska, shaken but pledging somehow to find those who masterminded this day of mayhem and massacre.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
Our New York business correspondent, Stephen Evans, was in the World Trade Center when the planes hit the towers. Stephen was telling a local New York television station what he'd seen when, during the interview, one of the towers collapsed behind him.
We had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. The thing that strikes me is, one, the terribleness of the incident, whatever the cause, and we don't go into the politics, but whatever the cause, the terribleness, the hugeness of what's happened. So huge, in fact, that most of the people around simply can't understand what happened. People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God. We gotta go. Oh my God. We gotta go. Right, well, sorry, it's going down. It's going down. Don't worry, it's going down. It's going down. From here. But you need to shoot. Sorry, it's not like... Quick! Don't go into a building. There's no game. Right, come on. Get this. We're good here.
And Stephen Evans joins us now in New York. Stephen, first, there's news that another building has collapsed. Can you confirm it?
I can't confirm that anything has collapsed, but all I can confirm is that all the buildings in that complex, that vast complex that normally employs 50,000 people, must be tottering. I think we can bring you pictures of the scene as it is now, and you will see dust everywhere. What strikes me about the pictures is that a lot of the emergency vehicles have got dust and debris on top of them, and that's because they arrived there very, very quickly indeed, and then new buildings collapsed, new devastation was caused. I don't think anybody really knew how that structure, nor could anybody know how those structures would react to an aircraft, two aircraft flying into them. So the thing now is that nobody quite knows what's underneath that debris.
How long did it take people to realise how serious the situation was, that the buildings were doomed? When you were down there when you heard the first impact, how long did it take people to catch on that they had to get out?
It took people, people immediately knew they had to get out. People immediately knew that there was something serious going on. But actually, you didn't know how serious. I didn't know how serious until, what are we now, 9 hours later. It is sinking in very, very slowly. One of the things, as I said, that happened was people got out and then simply stood at the base thinking, well, we've evacuated the building, therefore we're safe. And then literally hundreds of ambulances arrived on the scene, fire engines, whatever, and parked in that complex. One of the questions I think that will arise is how many people have died, if you like, in the aftermath of the accident. There is, if you like, a psychological aftermath of the accident as well. You might be able to see behind me Times Square, which is normally one of the busiest parts of this city. It is deserted now, partly because it's been closed off to traffic so that ambulances can get up and down this island, ferrying people wherever they need to be ferried. But also, people, I think, have gone home. It's a cliche in these events, if we've ever had an event like this one, that people are shocked and stunned. But they are. The few people who are down there are simply looking up at boards with the latest news and not saying very much indeed.
Stephen Evans, thank you. It may be at least 24 hours before there's any accurate estimate of how many have died in the attack, but the mayor of New York said tonight the death toll would be more than any of us could bear. He also appealed for blood donations for the injured, who've been taken to 170 hospitals across New York.
Rescue workers overwhelmed by their task. For New York, this was a nightmare come true. The scale of the carnage remains unclear, but it's possible that many thousands of people may have been killed. It's still too dangerous for the authorities to search the rubble that was the World Trade Center. The National Guard has been sent in to relieve exhausted firemen. The hospitals are overwhelmed.
Let's cut away now, straight away, to the latest pictures we've had coming in from New York. There we can see what looks like the Salomon Brothers building, which is the third building, which is just about to collapse. And these pictures, they came in just a few moments ago. It's 47 stories high. The World Trade Center towers were 110 stories high. And this building appears to have been weakened by debris or perhaps parts of the plane from the initial crash. You can see the building go there. And you can also imagine the difficulties faced by the emergency services on the streets of Manhattan as they try to conduct their rescue efforts, not knowing which, if any, of the buildings around them is also likely to collapse in just that way. This, of course, is not just New York's financial center, or indeed the United States financial center, but it is the world's financial center. And it's expected that among the casualties, the tremendous loss of life, as Mayor Giuliani talked about, there will be many people who are not American, because many Japanese, many Europeans, many Chinese business people work in the World Trade Center and in the buildings round about it.
The fact that there is still not even an estimate of the numbers dead defines the human tragedy. In a moment, David Sells will describe what happened, but first we go live to the scene in New York, and our correspondent, Stephen Evans. Stephen, we're receiving reports now of another building collapsing.
That's right, Jeremy. A third building has collapsed. We had the collapse of the two main towers about an hour after the actual explosion, which was about 9:15 in the morning. If you wanted to calculate a time to cause maximum disruption, you would calculate that time. It's the start of the working day and perhaps the biggest, busiest complex in the world. There were those two explosions. I was at the base of one of those buildings and it literally shook. Then people fled out, fled away. One of the problems, it seems to me, is that people didn't quite know how far to go. So then the emergency services starting to arrive, and the collapse of the building happened, of one of the buildings, one of the initial buildings, happened when people were actually quite close to it. But you're absolutely right. We've now had this third building falling to the ground. It is very difficult to imagine anything standing at the end of it all in this complex of 7 buildings. If you think back to the Canary Wharf bombing in the Docklands of London, for example, it was one bomb. One imagines that most of the damage was superficial, if you like, not to the structures themselves, to glass, to furniture. Looking at that scene this morning here in New York, it's hard to imagine anything surviving those two explosions.
Can there be any kind of rescue operation here, given what's happened?
I can't imagine that there will be any kind of rescue operation. It's absolutely impossible to estimate the kinds of numbers under that kind of debris. 50,000 people, as I say, work in those buildings. But one of the problems, it seems to me, and I was just alluding to it, is that the emergency services got there rapidly. There were hundreds of ambulances and fire trucks very, very quickly there. People assumed that the thing was contained. People assumed that there was a series of explosions quite high up in the buildings, and realized quite late, if you like, that actually the thing wasn't contained and the engineering couldn't cope with the force of those blows. So there will be high casualties from the initial attacks, but there may well be casualties from later. I don't know if the lifts were working or not, but I imagine there would have been people who simply couldn't have got down those 110 stories after the attacks. So, as I say, the authorities are now very, very wary indeed. They have structures barely standing amongst the 4 that are now remaining. So I would imagine that they're standing back and trying to make engineering assessments of what can be done. Meanwhile, in the rest of the city, there is an eerie calm here. I'm on Times Square. It's normally one of the busiest parts of this city. You can see it now. There's virtually nobody there. It's normally blasted with adverts. They've, by and large, been turned off. That's partly because the city's been closed so that ambulances can get from the World Trade Center to hospitals, but it's also because people have simply gone home. There wasn't panic when those bombs went up. People were very orderly. There was fear in their voices. Their eyes were getting moist, but people weren't really screaming like you think they might have been screaming. But they've now had, 9.5 hours to think about this thing, and these things do take time to actually sink into your brain. There's a bit of anger about. The American networks are talking about, they're using captions like the attack on America. They're using the words Pearl Harbor quite a lot. They're talking about incidents galvanizing action.
Okay, Stephen Evans in New York, thank you very much indeed. We're joined now as well by Tom Carver in Washington.
Also hier stimmt alles nicht. Und da müsste eigentlich BBC wirklich überlegen und sagen, okay, ja, tut uns leid, es ist einfach Fake News. Aber das schaffen die nicht. Und erst 2008, als es sehr viel Druck gab, hat sie dann gesagt, das war ein Fehler.
Well, in New York, the rescue effort is really just getting underway after the collapse of not just the World Trade Center's Twin Towers, but also the 47-story Solomon building next door to it. For the latest, we can go now to New York and join our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, bring us up to date, if you can, on what's happening now.
Well, we still have no further concrete word on casualty figures, as you said, though people are expecting very horrific numbers. And we know that some of those are New York City police officers. We think about 100. And we have unconfirmed as yet reports that as many as 200 firefighters may have been killed and 70 police officers are missing. They were emergency personnel around the building when the towers fell down. So New York in a state of panic and of great grief.
After the collapse of the Solomon building, Jane, are the other buildings in that area stable? Hello, Jane?
Nada.
No, I think we've lost Jane Stanley in New York. We'll try and get back to her later. Deborah.
And now a summary of the main news.
Wenn Sie jetzt nach New York gehen und Sie gehen zum Ground Zero, dann gibt es dort zwei große, tiefe Löcher. Und das heißt, das 9/11 Memorial lenkt die Aufmerksamkeit der Besucher auf die Twin Towers, dass die nicht mehr da sind. Dass das WTC 7 nicht mehr da ist, das finden Sie nicht heraus. Da gibt es kein Loch. Also auch hier, man hätte 3 Löcher machen müssen. Aber macht man natürlich nicht. Und das Memorial besteht aus 2 großen Löchern im Boden in New York. Das heißt, die Leute, die das Memorial anschauen, denken wieder, es sind 2 Türme. Es gibt nicht 3 Löcher, weil eigentlich müsste es 3 Löcher haben. Es sind nämlich 3 zusammengestürzt. Das heißt, auch Gedenkstätten können die Verwirrung vertiefen, indem sie die Gedanken der Menschen lenken. Kein Hinweis auf WTC 7. Keiner. Ist für mich jetzt nichts Neues. Man hat immer wieder eigentlich die Menschen getäuscht.
Die Gedenkstätte zu den Terroranschlägen, wenn man da hingeht, sind nur 2 Löcher. Es wird eben nicht auf das WTC 7 hingewiesen, sondern das sind jetzt nur die Löcher von den Twin Towers. Und dazwischen gibt es dieses Museum und das WTC 7 gibt es nicht. Es gibt es einfach nicht. Es ist aus der Erinnerung ausgelöscht. Und ja, das ist eigentlich der Versuch, die Geschichtsschreibung zu manipulieren.
And the memorial focuses the attention of people on the Twin Towers because there's huge gaps. It doesn't focus you on World Trade Center 7. In fact, if you go to New York today, you'd never think that 3 towers collapsed because the history, as it's in the memorial, is 2. Okay, that's the official history. And a good friend of mine who's seen my talks on World Trade Center 7 has written me, gee, Dan, I've just been to New York. This is crazy. If you're there, it's all full of the Twin Towers, nothing on World Trade Center 7. You know, they should, of course, have the video of World Trade Center 7 on the billboard right there, and it's coming down all the time. That would give a whole different sense to the whole memorial site. Wenn Sie die Memorial-Stätte besuchen in New York, dann sehen Sie, da gibt es hier große
sind eigentlich die Fußstapfen, wo die Twin Towers standen. Das heißt, ihre Achtsamkeit wird auf die Twin Towers gelenkt. Gibt es auch so ein Loch beim WTC 7? Nein. Hat das einen Einfluss? Ja. Denken Sie mal, da wäre nichts, kein Memorial. Und die ganze Memorial-Sache wäre bei WTC 7. Riesenloch, die Leute müssen darüber nachdenken, da würde groß stehen, wurde nie vom Flugzeug getroffen, aber ist auch eingestürzt.
Bells tolling at 8:46 and 9:03, the moment when terrorists attacked the World Trade Center 22 years ago.
Alvin Peter Kappelman Jr.
Then the emotional reading of nearly 3,000 names of those who died that day.
And my poppy, Gerard Patrick Frank, firefighter from Rescue Company 3. I miss you and love you. I wish you got to take me fishing. We love you, Poppy.
Pain for lost family members, both fresh and lingering.
I just hope you're proud of who I've grown up to be. Thank you for loving us, Dad, and thank you for being my dad.
Tonight, a nation honoring a promise to never forget. Rahima Ellis, NBC News, New York.